Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all well wherever I greet you from today. This is the final of our 3 webinars. Today, finalising our a planning focus is around looking at forecasts. Clearly, we've got a recovery as we come out of these restrictions, but I wanted to share with you some information. A lot of it I've actually gleaned from brands, from recent presentation, thinking about what the commercial and residential markets are going to look like and what's driving the assumptions, the figures that we can start to consider with our own planning. Let's think about today's agenda. Firstly, I want to have a look at the residential market. We'll identify what are the key assumptions that drive the forecasts, and then I'd like to actually look at building consent by type, and then also thinking about regional. How are we looking? And we've actually broken that down by regions based with the proposed new climate zones. So I hope that'll be of interest to a lot of you. Then we'll move on into looking at non-residential commercial, again, try and understand the assumptions that drive the forecast, and looking at where we think the growth is going to occur across the main sectors. And then we will finish with a summary and a Q&A. Just make note that we'll have the chat line running if you've got any questions or comments, so we'll be monitoring that. Great. And let's have a look at our residential assumptions. Think about the demand, what's driving the demand. We've clearly understand the relationship between net migration and the impact that that's had over the last decade. Government uses a term called new household formation. So effectively when we're looking at net migration or increase in population of 2.8 people, effectively government then suggests where a new household is formed. So we can use the numbers that we get from population growth to determine the number of new houses that need to be created. And obviously interest rates, so the cost of money drives a lot of activity in our industry. So, one of the key drivers has been around trying to understand what sort of shortage exists in the market. Before we do, though, what are some of the other influences? We've heard of banks who are stress testing new mortgage applications at 5 to 6% interest rates. So we've got a busy level of activity. Banks are obviously being more picky and making sure that the clients that they're bringing on board can cope with a growing, increasing interest rate market. Still seeing first buyer activity looking to come in, at high levels of activity. So that's a big driver of the demand. I suppose the question mark is really around with investment being less attractive with recent changes. It's a real unknown around how much growth we can get out of that investor market. At the moment, it seems that seems to be high. Whether or not that's just there'll be a lag period there is something we really do want to keep an eye on. Thinking about the housing shortage. So we've got a wide range that's been given by government, somewhere between 30,000 and 200,000 homes short. Auckland Council a little bit more specific, thinking the shortage in the wider Auckland region is around 15,000. So it's important that we consider that, particularly at the levels we are consenting. We're at record levels. Question around how many we're actually building. Consensus seems to be between that sort of 27 and 29,000 dwellings per year is what we're actually building, compared to what we're consenting at the moment, which is over 40,000. One of another areas we're not quite sure is what the influence of demolition work. So where we've actually got large sections, particularly in urban areas like Auckland, where we're taking a small dwelling off and we're putting on 5 or 6 townhouses. That's not actually picked up in terms of the modelling around land availability. So there's a bit of a grey area there. When we look at population growth, brands put together a slide which looks at number of consents, and that goes through to 2019, and then this notion of the new household formation. We can actually see that after the GFC, we're still consenting houses, but we actually did not have the population growth. Clearly, that's increased, and it's well documented what happened, in the last 10 years. But we've been playing catch up. We just haven't been able to build the number of homes to catch up. So that sort of explained, part of the reason why we've got this shortfall. Another metric to look at is house sales. So you can see in the red there, we've actually got the house sales activity. It's got a common sense trend. If house sales are up, you would consider that building activity would be strong as well. Started to get a few wobbles around that in 2004, and we had a bit of a correction, and then we went through the GFC and came out. But we started getting to 2016 into 2017. We could see that the amount of activity in house sales actually became quite stabilized, and we had this large growth in the number of building consents driven by a number of factors. But what's interesting here is we're certainly out of sync. So an interesting dynamic for us to consider is actually having a look at the capacity of the industry, particularly with main contractors. And as we can see, as we've gone from 2010 and onwards, we can see that we've had this growth, and in particular, just this huge stretch as we came out of COVID. And I suppose it's just telling us what we already know, is that there's very little elasticity in the main contractor market. So think about the big buckets in terms of building new homes. Well, we've got the land availability. General suggestion is that we still need more information. There's the national monitoring system is getting up and running, but still we're a little bit in the dark there. We look at our bigger regions, and Auckland dominates us just because of the number of building consents. We think about the amount of land that's been released in the way of that. I talked about demolition before, but these subdivisions that are happening in our tight urban centres. No great concern of what's actually holding us back. Financing is of interest, particularly as banks look to raise their capital levels, and they're putting more onus on those new mortgage applications, just as I mentioned, stress testing. I suppose a big consideration is we need to think about that investor class. So how active they will be with the new legislation the government's put in place, and their ability to access finance, and particularly the strength of that second tier lending, how that supports our main banks in driving those developer-led projects. So in summary, in a residential market, we certainly see that the government build program is going to continue to be extremely strong. We know the housing shortage still exists. Question marks around, the size of that. That is still something that will be present for at least the short term. The capacity, well, we're running at record levels in terms of workload. And house pricing, there was some suggestion that house pricing was going to cool off. We're certainly hearing that the increase in house values is cooling. When that translates to actually a correction in house prices, no one's actually forecast anything like that yet. Okay, land availability, we think that's neutral, and certainly finance is the one thing that is developing as a constraint for the market. So, in terms of looking at the short-term view, it's a pretty optimistic scene, really. The medium term is something we're not so sure about. I've got a particular focus over the next sort of 2 to 3 years, which is what I want to focus on the forecasts. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual forecasts. This is from a recent brands forecast that was done in August. And what it's telling us that when we look across the country, forecasts remain at above 40,000 building consents for the next 3.5 years. So, that's a pretty significant forecast for us to consider, particularly when we think about where we've come from. And, I started EBOSS in 2006, and I can remember doing some surveys on the amount of forward work when we came into 2010, 2011, and we're sitting at 11,500, 12,000 building consents per annum. Look at the jump we've had from 2019 onwards. It's so significant, just this leap that we've had in the last 12 months and that remaining. There's so many considerations to think about here. I'm thinking about our audience today. We've got architects and product suppliers. We've got councils. We all need to be considering, how we approach our work and how, as an industry, we can look at getting anywhere close to be able to deliver this level of activity. Oh, and yes, Andrew's got a comment here. Have you allowed for the effect of the new national policy statement on urban development? Andrew, great question. We're going to get onto that when we actually start looking at building type, but I think the short answer is no. I think there's still some room and just room for growth here. So just to bring you up to speed, which National Policy Statement is around the densification of our centre cities and nodes. Council's looking at increasing the height of building within 15 minutes of CPDs or 10 minutes of town centres, encouraging that 6-storey or greater form. And Andrew, thanks for that. That'll lead us into the building types that we've included in the forecast. What I've got here as a reference is our 2019 forecast numbers. So these are actual successful building consent applications. First of all, we want to have a look at detached housing. Now, we had been sort of travelling at somewhere between 20 to 22,000, standalone dwellings, nationally for the last four and a half years. So we can see that's increased by a couple of thousand and will continue to increase. This is still our most popular form of building. And, we can see we're going to remain at these very high levels. So pre-2019 levels right through into 2026 is what this forecast suggests. When we look at townhouses, we can actually start to see some considerable growth has occurred over the last 2 years. And we all would have seen that. But again, the townhouse design continues at these record levels. In fact, when we look at Auckland, it's the largest number of dwellings for the first time ever in our townhouses as opposed to detached. So we can see the popularity, and with that, the extra considerations around noise and fire that we're all aware of. Interesting, we do see that, in the forecast here, we're actually getting down to, a considerable drop. So that'll be something for us to monitor is whether this, because it's still a relatively new form or dwelling type, this growth has occurred pretty quickly. So we're learning about how to build better quality medium density, whether over time as we become more experienced with it, that encourages us to continue with that growth, something for us to monitor. Then the apartment market, John, yes, hopefully this answers your question here. So we've got townhouses as a separate bucket. So when we look at the level of apartment activity, we can see that it's pretty stable actually over the next 3 to 4 years. I think the National Policy Statement is really something that's in its own life now. I think it's a form for developers to try and understand and just to get some confidence around not only the buildability, but also the demand in the market for it. So still a significant part of the market, but we don't see the growth that we're seeing in that lower form of medium density. We've also got a comment around the retirement dwellings. When we look at the dwelling type here now, again, let's come back to what dwellings look like in the retirement sector, because we've got a blend now of these more urban centres where we could actually have 4 to 6 storey form, just like Somerset are doing here in Auckland in St John's, right through to the detached villas. So this sort of buckets puts all of those into the same buckets, all right, groups them all together and shows that we've got a consistent growth over the next 4 or 5 years. When you talk to the individual operators, they certainly seem to think that this growth is going to continue. I don't think their sort of sentiment's been picked up in this forecast. Again, this is from brands. It's more about the drivers that we looked at before. So yeah, some interesting numbers. But when we look at this and consider we're at right through into 2024 and 2025, we're at above 40,000 building consents. Significant amount of activity. All right, so that was looking at building type. Now we actually want to look at the spread across the country. And I'm going to use the new climate zones, which MB are looking to bring in. May well be familiar at the moment. We've got 3 climate zones, that's going to 6. So first zone here. So Darren, your question, do we know if and when those climate zones are meant to come into play? We know that MB has this annual cycle now that they've talked about. They'll be bringing in the changes to the building code, which effectively the timing's around November. We are still planning on that announcement coming out in November, so nothing we have heard has talked about delaying that, but there's been no definitive date. I suppose the purpose here, Darren, is just to make sure that we're thinking over the next 3 or 4 years, and we'll be very confident the zoning will be brought in place by then. So Zone 1 is our northern regions, so Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. What we can see here is across those 4 areas, again, very strong levels of townhouse activity. And, we can see the growth in the apartment market over the next 3 years. Here, when you're thinking around requirements under, or the new thermal requirements that MB are looking to bring in, again, Darren, to your point, not sure what level they're going to set that at. We're obviously very interested because it's going to impact a large part of the building form. We can see that a really strong townhouse and apartment market continuing, centered around Auckland, but also some work in, and around Tauranga. So when we get into to Zone 2, we're now thinking about that Greater Waikato, the East Cape and Taranaki, and we see the dominance of the detached housing. But again, we're starting to see some developments of terraced housing, townhouses coming into some of our smaller regional centres. Still good, consistent levels of work in the retirement sector as well. Moving into Zone 3, so there's the lower North Island and into the top of the South Island. We can actually see some pretty good growth in that townhouse market as well. The stability in that apartment market really driven in the Wellington region, but it gives us a good sense of the mix. And really, along with all of these slides here, we've actually got good regional growth in all zones. Probably the slowest zone is this one here. We think about the central plateau, the Wairarapa, and the west coast of the South Island. When we look at building consent growth over the next 4 years, we're probably looking at an extra 300 or 400 residential building consents. So we're still growing, quite a bit smaller when compared to that Auckland, Northland, Bay of Plenty area, which has about 3,500 more dwellings over that period of time. No apartments in the scene, but again, we're looking at consistency in the retirement village sector, and again, some opportunities for that medium density in townhouses. Right, so now moving into the Greater Canterbury region and coastal Otago, we can see that, there's plenty of land availability in that Christchurch market, and we can have some confidence that that'll be brought on stream for we've got many years to go there, and the medium density, that townhouse form, is obviously something that's been well proven there. So continued support and forecast demand. And finally, when we look at our inland Otago, Southland, and don't forget Stewart Island. Again, we can see some consistent levels around the townhouses. Yes, they're smaller numbers, but this is not just medium density is not just a story for our larger centres. So it needs to be considered by all of us, whether it's design, construction, or product solutions. What have we got that's actually going to be able to meet the requirements of these different climate zones, but also making sure we've got the right level of resourcing and expertise for the construction that's required. Okay, we're at 12:30 now, so I've probably got about another 15 minutes for us just to cover off the commercial market. And the one thing I wanted to focus on, how the relationship between GDP and the commercial sector. As we look at GDP forecast growth, we can see a bit of a turbulent time here as we do come out of current situation. But we're still expecting good GDP growth, and then that dropping off as we get a more stabilised position. But Brands came up with this modelling, which is looking at how we can, if there's any relationship between commercial construction and also infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is actually quite wobbly. There's quite a bit of impact or influence by government, particularly government change and new budgets. But here we can see that we've actually got, a relative relationship between real GDP and commercial consents. I think that's something for us to be able to monitor. It's a good yardstick for us to consider. We're thinking about the strength of this market. And as we come out of here with what we believe is good forecast GDP growth for at least the next couple of years, it should give us some confidence. All right. So when we look at the commercial forecast, let's consider the main kind of segments of the commercial market. So here I've just got a snapshot of building consent value up until this July 2021, comparing the last 3 years. This captures about $7.8 billion worth of commercial value in the last 12 months. And you can see education is now over 20% of the entire commercial market. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I've just grabbed this directly from Stats NZ, but we've got our 10 main segments here, and I'm going to break them down into 3 big buckets for the forecast. First is the institutional projects. So here we're thinking about schools, thinking about healthcare, and also just sort of other government building programs, particularly prisons is a large one at the moment. We can see here this big jump as we're getting to over $3 billion worth of value for the year. So this is a significant amount. It's getting up to 40% of the value of our commercial market is effectively government as a client. And we've got schoolwork, which is sitting at about $1.5 billion a year annually, sort of levels. So huge amount of focus there, but also a big commitment into our health sector. Let's compare that to our commercial markets. And now we're thinking about offices, shops, hotels and accommodation. And here we can see we're still at strong levels, but it's a broad mix across those 3 types. Again, the office, retail and the accommodation and hospitality market. So sitting at that, you can see because of the impacts of COVID, it actually has an increasing trend as we particularly get our heads back into full retail and office work. So we've got a growing trend over time. There's a recovery story here. And finally, let's look at our industrial forecast. So here we're thinking about factories, we're thinking about storage, so warehousing, and also rural development. So again, we've got strong growth, particularly here into 2021. Just had this unprecedented demand for local manufacturing and also increase in storage. And we've got a slight cooling off and then we can start to see that sort of solid kind of, it's really historical growth as we come in, getting us to well above record levels. And interesting to note that think about the commercial market. As I mentioned before, last 12 months, we're sitting at $7.8 billion worth of consented value. Based on these forecasts, we're actually getting up to over 9. So we've got a 15% increase, up to 20% increase on the levels we're at the moment. What I find interesting here is that we picked this up in our poll to begin with. We've actually got, for those of us who are sort of in the trenches, we sort of feel that there's it's a patchier market. It's becoming more and more defined by these sort of larger landmark projects. So I think we do have to be very mindful and diligent around keeping close to those projects we are engaged with. And a common theme here over the next few years is really going to be the shortage of labour and also just how we actually deal and forecast the delivery of materials. And, obviously it's something we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. Always happy to share any views or comments just around those difficulties. Particularly, I think the industry is desperate for where are suggestions or recommendations where we can do things better as an industry to be more efficient. Okay, so I'm actually going to summarise there. We're thinking about our residential forecast. We've got some strong drivers there that we need to be monitoring what we do in terms of obviously migration, which has been a lot of talk about, but that local demand by our current population, what that looks like, and what are the things that government are putting in place to help drive or change that demand. Talked about all of the regions are growing, and so we've certainly got a regional story here. This is not just a urban-centric situation. So again, for us as designers, builders, and suppliers, we need to make sure that we're mindful in our planning around how we're actually going to be able to service that growth. And in many cases, where are the areas that we need to focus? If we've had a wider focus before and we're in a growing market, where are the areas we need to tighten up on? Then looking at the commercial market, I've introduced this concept of, monitoring the relationship between GDP and the demand for that commercial market. Certainly, there's a strong influence from government as a client into the levels of work we've got at the moment. It certainly seems to be strong workflow that's driving that, something for us to monitor, particularly as we get close to the election. Industrial sector, very strong at the moment, but also that commercial market we see stabilising for the next sort of three or so years, and then we've got that historic growth kicking in, driving towards record levels. We look at both parts of the market, extremely strong forecasts. They are just that. They're an estimate. But I think what's important for us is to be able to consider, how do we as an industry service record levels of work? And how do we do that with the constraints that we currently face? Where are the areas of opportunity for us to be able to be more efficient? I know we've got a few in the audience here who are from local councils and BCAs. So again, opportunities where we can work together as a wider industry to be able to deliver work to building site just more seamlessly, and obviously with a strong focus on how we can deliver cost-effective solutions. But I've just got one question here from John. Any information available on the financial funding capital forecast? John, it's a good question. We know there's money floating around everywhere, but how it actually is channeled into the building industry, I haven't actually seen some high-level forecasts on that. So there's no data that I've got to be able to present to you today. I'd be very interested if anyone had any information they'd like to share, can certainly send that out to the wider group. I do think that having an understanding of that is important, particularly the impact on that developer market. So John, sorry I can't answer your question, but hope we can get something to you in the near future on that. All right, well, with that in mind, I hope those of you in Auckland are busy preparing for hopefully some good news next week. And for those of you outside of Auckland, that you're enjoying the fruits of level 2, and that you're well supporting the level of building work that's going on outside of areas in level 4. So we'll conclude here. Always grateful to get your feedback. If you've got any particular comments, feel free to email me, matthew@eboss.co.nz. Thanks for watching. This was the end of our sort of our strategic planning webinars, but if you've got any other tips for future topics or speakers, more than happy to pull another session together. So thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.